Okay, so Ingerman and Sokoloff, they categorize the Americas into two types of colonies: extractive colonies and settler colonies. Your extractive colonies are going to be centered around extracting some resource and transferring that back to the colonizer, either the elites in the colony or back to Europe. Your settler colonies are going to look like neo Europes. Essentially, these are going to be places with lots of settlers from Europe, not lots, but your settlers from Europe. And what they're going to do is they're going to essentially have lots of small scale farms, so like family farms, and they are going to replicate the existing European institutions. So they are going to have kind of strong property rights for the European settlers, whereas your extractive colonies are not really going to have a broad protection of property rights. Essentially, the goal there is essentially, the elites own everything. The elites do whatever they want, and they are essentially, just transferring resources up. Your extractive colonies can take two forms. There's sugar colonies, which have economies of scale in agriculture, which means it's very hard to have a small scale sugar farm. Like the way sugar is farmed, it needs to have a large operation. Yeah, and so these are places where we're going to have or are going to be characterized by usually slave labor, not always, but usually slave labor. And they're going to be a small landed elite in these places, like the plantation owners, that are getting wealthy off of this labor and the export of sugar, and then maybe some investors back in Europe who are also getting wealthy. You're going to also your other type of extractive colony that Sokoloff and Ingerman have kind of categorized are hacienda colonies. These are typically places, like Peru, or Mexico, with large native populations. There's a large existing native population, the Aztecs or the Incas, and essentially the Spanish have come in and essentially, conquer these places, made them colonies. The goal there is then to transfer the mineral wealth, usually mineral wealth. Sometimes there will be, kind of large scale farming operations. Oftentimes they'll just take the existing extractive institutions and then replace the elite with themselves, where, wealth is kind of transferred up to that elite and then back to Spain. Usually, these are primarily Spanish colonies. All right, so you have like basically your extracted colonies and your settler colonies. Okay, your settler colonies are the poor colonies. These are basically just small farming operations. There's not much wealth flowing back to the colonizing country, whereas your sugar and hacienda colonies are wealthy in this time period. Okay, remember we're back in the 1500s, 1600s. Everyone is poor by today's standards. Standard of living is very, very low. Um, but in the sugar and hacienda colonies, you do have some existing wealthy elite. So relative to the settler colonies, these colonies are richer. So these are places like, Brazil, um, Peru, as I mentioned, Jamaica. So you have some existing wealthy elites. So these are the wealthy areas um, during the colonial period. So once again, like South Carolina is much wealthier during the colonial period than New York, okay, because it has this extractive system, where wealth is transferred up. Okay, so okay, all right. So sorry, you have the slides. I'm just going through the slides. You can follow along as you watch this. Okay, so what determines the type of colony that is set up? And Ingerman and Sokoloff point to the initial endowments of that colony. What is the soil like? Can you grow sugar? Can you not grow sugar? What is the climate, disease, environment? All right, is this place deadly or not for incoming Europeans? What does the native population look like, and what are the existing institutions of the native population? What is essentially the existing economy like? So, depending on these endowments, the colony will either take the form of a settler colony or an extractive colony. If it's a settler colony, it's going to have one set of institutions, essentially broad protection of property rights. Um, if it's an extractive colony, it's not going to have that many guaranteed of property rights. Your settler colonies will also maybe develop some commitment to education, like broad education, whereas your extractive colonies won't do that. Those early institutions then lead to the present day institutions, and those present day institutions determine economic growth. All right. Okay, so let's look at some evidence for this from the lecture notes. Okay, so here we have mortality on the x-axis. This is settler mortality. So this is Europeans going to places. How often do they die? So I think this is Mali. This is very deadly. Okay. Whereas New Zealand, Australia over here are not that deadly. Essentially, the disease environments are roughly similar to Europe. So they're not that deadly for European immigrants. So these over here are more likely to be your settler colonies based on the initial endowments. One of the things that determines initial endowments is how deadly is the disease environment. It's hard to have lots of settlers when many of them are dying. So the less deadly the environment is, the more likely the place is to become a settler colony. Then on the y-axis, we have present day institutions. So present day institutions, this is essentially property rights. The higher you are on here, the more protection you have of property rights. And so what this is just scatter plot is kind of showing is this loose relationship between initial endowments of a place and present day institutions. Here's what I went over previously. So the Ingerman and Sokoloff theory is that you have some initial endowments that determines whether you're a settler or extractive colony. That determines then the institutions that place had. Then that leads to present day institutions, which matter for economic growth. All right. So here we go. What are those institutions? So we have a settler colony. These are broadly going to be among the European settlers. European settlers will broadly be loosely equal in terms of their standard of living. All right. They're essentially all farmers. There's maybe, the head of the colony, which is a little wealthier, but they're broadly mostly farmers living a very similar existence. This loose equality will lead to certain set of institutions more likely to adopt democracy, more likely to have public goods. So public goods would be things like infrastructure, schooling, that sort of thing. So they're more likely to have some level of public good provision, some infrastructure, and then broadly some commitment to equality of opportunity. Since we're all kind of equal here, let's give everyone a fair chance. In your extractive colonies, remember you got a small group of elite. So in all these places, you have your like plantation owners or your mine or people in charge of the mines. The goal there is to maintain that elite status, to maintain that extractive enterprise going on. And so essentially everything is enacted to protect the elite, to keep that elite in power. And if you go to many of these former colonies, if you go to many of your Latin American colonies, you can trace the current elites all the way back to the colonial period. Okay, and so we're going to have expropriation, which could take the form of like forced labor. They're literally expropriating the labor of others. Barriers to entry, so it's going to be very, very hard. There's not going to be a lot of market competition. So, if I have a plantation, I don't want other plantations competing with me. So it's going to be very difficult to set up new operations. There's going to be barriers enacted by these governments to stifle competition, to stifle new enterprises coming online that may threaten the existing extractive enterprises. Okay, and there's going to be lots of tribute or taxes, wealth moving up. Okay, so those are the different types of institutions, and these institutions persist. So there's this link here. This is the link between those colonial institutions to the present day institutions. How does that happen? Okay. And so essentially, when these places ultimately get their independence from Europe, they replicate many of the institutions. They don't like fundamentally change their institutions. So you think of an unfavorable court system. that kind of they keep the court system the way it is because of kind of sunk costs. They're already doing these things. It's hard to, redo, whatever your, rewrite your laws, that sort of thing. So one of the reasons why things stay the same post independence is sunk costs. Incentives, essentially your elites, in many cases, just it's the same elites. So you may have, you may not be a colony anymore. You may be an independent country, but your elites are the same. Or you may have, if you have like a violent revolution, later on, many of these countries have violent revolutions, and you do get kind of a new group of elites, but then they realize, all right, it's nice being an elite. Okay, it's nice controlling everything. And so they don't broadly open, they don't broadly open up the franchise. They don't open up democracy. They kind of keep those barriers in place. They keep expropriating, because essentially, if you're an elite in these places, your life is pretty good. And then lastly, there's just kind of complementarity between skills and institutions. What that means is the population has gotten used to this is the way things are. So, for instance, if you're just kind of used to a level of corruption, if you're just used to a level of corruption in your public bureaucracy, you kind of know how to navigate it. Okay, I got to bribe this person. I got to go to this place. I got to do this. That's how things get done there. And so you've kind of developed those skills. Whereas, if I'm a foreigner coming into this place, I don't know who to bribe. I don't know who to talk to. But many of the people there, they know kind of how to navigate this corrupt system. All right. So there's like this famous, like a famous example of this, or a great example of this, um, comes from this businessman and author DeSoto, who looks at he looks at Peru. And so, and he says, what if I want to start a business? This is present day. He says, what if I want to start a business in Peru? Okay. He said, I like to start a business. And he's like essentially a member of a league. He's like, his family's Peruvian, but he was like raised in Switzerland, and he's wealthy, and he kind of goes back to Peru with the goal of like he's trying to help Peru. And so he's like thinking about, he's going around, he's talking to business owners, and then talking about how hard it is to enter the formal sector, to formally set up a business. Once you formally set up a business, get all the permits you need, then you can start to raise capital, and you kind of can grow from a small shop to kind of a medium-sized shop, medium-sized enterprise. And these are really missing in Peru. It's kind of like these small scale, like local vendors, and then you have your like big conglomerates, but there's not really that. You're kind of missing this middle. And so DeSoto is like interested in this problem. And so he's going around. He's like, okay, what are the barriers here? Why can't these small businesses grow? And he realizes when talking to them that most of them are just locked out of the formal sector. They're not officially businesses. And so he says, all right, if I'm trying to set up a business, what do I have to do? And he talks to his friend in the government, and his friend in the government is like, all right, yeah, no problem. I'll get you what you need to start a business. No problem. Here you go. Takes him, about a week. All right. For a member of the elite. This is DeSoto. He has connections. Then he says, let me try to do it if I didn't know anybody. Let me just try to set up a business. And he hires a grad student. He says, you're, grad student, try to get all the necessary forms to set up a business. It takes the grad student, I can't remember the exact number, but I believe it's 273 days, working 8 hours a day to get all the necessary forms, get all the necessary sign-offs to start a business. Okay. And so here you can kind of come back to, how these old institutions, how these barriers to entry, lead to present day institutions. And so the reason why this doesn't change is all this bureaucracy is in place. There's no incentive to change it because it's working for the existing elite. The existing elite, if they want to set up a business, they call the minister of finance or whoever, it gets done. So they don't even see the problem. They don't even see these barriers. It's not working for the rest of the population. And what it translates to is like essentially a few people being able to have businesses, thriving businesses, and everyone else being locked out. Okay, and you can see how this might matter for growth too. If you don't have competition, if you don't have like your best people entering into entrepreneurial enterprises, you're not going to get those dynamic businesses that drive growth post industrialization. Okay, all right, so that's like in a present day example, but let's see, how this theory played out, back in the colonial era. Remember the idea here. The idea of Ingerman and Sokoloff is that endowments determine the type of colony. like what is going on, in the existing colony in terms of, the climate, the crops, um, the existing populations, the existing native populations. That's going to determine the colony that gets set up. And so there's this great example from the article of these two colonies. So you have your Massachusetts Bay Colony and your and Providence Island. All right, they are both settled by the Puritans. So the Puritans is a religious group from England, and they're kind of famous in the present day, maybe not anymore, but 10, 15 years ago, or when I was growing up, we would learn about the Puritans, and they're very pious and they work hard. That is the stereotype that is out there, that comes from the famous Massachusetts Bay Colony. All right, that okay, these are very serious people that work super hard, year round in these foreboding conditions. Massachusetts, it's cold, it's terrible, it's still cold and terrible, in my opinion, as a Lakers fan. Um, and so that is kind of the stereotype of what Puritans are. All right, now, so you got a ship with one group of Puritans going to Massachusetts. You got another ship with another group of Puritans going to Providence Island. All right, so Providence Island's down here in the Caribbean. All right, they get there, they encounter a deadly disease environment. It's very hot. They're not used to it. They're not used to the climate. And what happens to that Protestant work ethic? They quickly import slaves and use natives and servants for labor. All right. So they don't work themselves. They essentially try to enact an extractive colony by expropriating labor from others. Whereas in Massachusetts, it's all small scale farming, and that's the one we know about. But there's another Puritan colony that essentially, so you have same culture, same people essentially, or similar people, but the endowments determined the type of institutions they pursued. You kind of have the reverse scenario in Canada, where France tries to set up like a hacienda style system, where we have the seigneur who kind of is in charge of this like large scale plantation. We have a bunch of essentially like bonded workers that work the land and have to pay tribute up to up to the head, the seigneur. Okay, that's like what they're going, similar to the hacienda system employed by the Spanish, where you have a bunch of people working the land, doing the actual work, paying tribute up to like a local elite. Now, here's the problem: there's no economies of scale in these agriculture. All right, so there's no reason why we need to have all our farming on one land. In other types of farming, it's beneficial to have these economies of scale where you can have specialization, and you kind of need to grow the crop in this manner, where you need to have like a large scale plantation. This is not so in wheat. Wheat you could just grow by yourself, essentially in a small family operation. So these people that are being forced to work the land say, why would I do this? I'm just going to move 5 miles this way, outside of, sorry, my arrow is getting messed up, outside of the reach of this local elite, and I'm going to set up a small scale farm. And so essentially they can't keep the people bonded to the land because they can just leave and live off the land themselves. And so again, the endowment here is it's conducive to small scale farming. And so it's hard to set up an extractive system when the people can just leave and set up small scale farms. Okay, let's take a break and let's go look at the data of all these different institutions.